Chapter 8. The house in Vine Street was both joined to and separated from its neighbour by a brick-built arch that led to the stable and yard. This arch was so clumsy in its brickwork that, skilful as was the coachman, he was forever scraping the paintwork of Miss Mansfield's curricle and her father's coach. But nothing was ever done to remedy this. Mr. Mansfield had grown used to the sound of it, and Miss Mansfield would allow no change to anything that helped her father to see with his ears or hands. So the carriages continued to be scraped, and the stable boy was forever being sent to the paint shop for pigment or varnish to make good the damage, which task fell naturally to Smith. It was on one of these journeys that he fell in with a certain muffin man, with whom he had an old street acquaintance. "Ain't I seed you before?" asked the muffin man, thrown out by Smith's cleanliness and livery. "Maybe," said Smith cautiously, and then decided to make use of the acquaintance. "Do you know the Red Lion Tavern in Saffron Hill?" The muffin man grinned. He knew it all right. "And do you know the two ladies what reside in its nether regions?" Smith's education had begun, and he'd acquired a fanciful taste in words. "The darlings in the cellar, Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny, everyone knows them." "The very same. I'd be obliged if you'd carry 'em a message." The muffin man thrust out his lower lip till it looked like the last quarter of a muffin. "Tell 'em a certain person's well and prospering. Tell 'em he's on his way up in the world, and will communicate further when a suitable occasion has arose." Much impressed, the muffin man nodded. "I'll tell 'em. Don't forget now, the certain person's on his way up in the world." Then, watched all the way by the admiring muffin man, Smith strolled back to the house in Vine Street, whistling cheerfully, for he just discharged a duty that had been weighing on him these 3 weeks past. He'd set his sisters' minds at rest, always supposing they'd ever been otherwise, and so had kept his word with Mr. Mansfield. He smiled somewhat wistfully as he pictured Miss Bridget's and Miss Fanny's face when they got his news, and he sighed when he thought of his friend Lord Tom. Well, well, they weren't gone forever. Some day soon they'd all meet again, when he'd got what he wanted from the document. His face darkened. The document was still in Mr. Mansfield's study, and not all of his wit and deftness had brought him any nearer to recovering it. When he was in the house, Miss Mansfield watched him like a brisk and suspicious hawk, and when he was in the yard, the coachman watched him even sharper, while the 3 ugly lumbering horses, Smith felt, kept more than an ordinary eye on him. At night he dared not try again, for Miss Mansfield slept light as a feather, and she'd give him no second chance. His credit on her kindness was stretched to its limit, and he shivered at the thought of its breaking, for he'd come, little by little, to think as well of the Mansfields as anyone else, Lord Tom and his sisters excepted, in the world, though both of them, on occasion, frightened him half to death. There were times when they did no such thing. There were times, even, when they made him grin, viz., when they quarrelled over which of them was to be blamed for a kindness. There were times when they made him shrug his shoulders in bewilderment, viz., when Miss Mansfield lit candles for her blind father and did everything to persuade the house he could see it, and yet she'd have nothing moved, be it ever so awkward and ill-placed, lest her father stumble against it and so betray what the whole world knew, viz., that he was blind as a mole. There were times when nothing pleased Smith more than Miss Mansfield's praise of his progress in reading, so that, for the moment, her good opinion seemed the chief purpose in his studying and not the document at all, of which studying Meg the scullery maid took a vexatious view. "Learning," she'd say contemptuously, While Smith sat in the kitchen of a late afternoon or evening, his small white face cupped in his thin white hands, staring up at Meg's big red face billowed in her big red arms. "Learning? Give you a farthing for it. Mark my words, little one. A human being's better off without it. What good's it ever done a soul? Brains? Wouldn't have 'em if you paid me. A pennorth of hearts worth of all your skinny clever heads." And she stared thoughtfully at Smith's own skinny face and pushed over a piece of pie as if to fill him out as quickly as possible. "I saw some clever heads once when I was a little girl. Me mother, God rest her, showed me 3 of 'em, a lord, a sir, and a mister, on the Trader's Gate, cut off at the neck. Very clever heads they was, and much good it did 'em. Meg," said she, I'll always remember her words. "Meg, take note. Heads without hearts is naught but bleedin' pom-poms, of no use to man, woman, or child." "But at least you can read, Meg," said Smith, munching at the pie, "for you read the name on that old paper you found when I was washed." Meg stared at him crossly as if she felt all her warning was wasted. "I can read what's proper and needful, young man, but no more than that. For instance, I've never read a book." "But what about Miss Mansfield?" Meg shut her eyes in vexation. "Yes, you look at the mistress, all trouble and worry and storms in the heart, and then you look at the master who can neither read nor write on account of his disability, which is maybe a blessing in disguise, all smiles and even-faced, all contentment, I'd say. There, now." Surprised by her own powers of observation, she opened her eyes triumphantly. "So who's the better off? Brains? Give you a farthing for them." But in spite of Meg's warnings, Smith continued to study as hard as he was able. He mastered the alphabet, that sinister collection of twists and curls and crosses and gibbet-shaped signs that resembled nothing so much as the irons that hung on Newgate's most dreadful walls, and by the time of his meeting with the Muffin Man, he could pronounce aloud such words as Miss Mansfield wrote on his slate. My name is Smith," he sputtered out with great difficulty, only understanding the sentiment as he heard the words he made. "Well done," cried Miss Mansfield, and Smith, though pleased to have pleased her, was mildly aggrieved to discover that so much effort had gone into saying aloud what was perfectly well known to both of them all the time. Nonetheless, he was much encouraged, and Miss Mansfield promised him that in but a short while more he'd be able to read whatever his heart desired. On which Smith's heart would stray towards Mr. Mansfield's study with an expression of great yearning and hope. Sometimes Mr. Mansfield himself would stay to listen to Smith's lesson, now and then explaining something of which his poor blind eyes still held the memory, but mostly he kept silent, save when he, too, had occasion to praise the boy's quickness and progress, and this, when it happened, moved Smith oddly, for he sensed a deep generosity behind it, and if anything could bring tears to Smith's eyes, apart from the thump on the nose, it was the sudden warmth of a generous heart. Nor were the Mansfields the only ones who were pleased by Smith's redemption from black ignorance, which was following so pat on his redemption from his other blackness. Mr. Billing had come to hear of Miss Mansfield's pupil, and the lad's arrival and subsequent improvement at Miss Mansfield's hands formed a fresh subject for his lively chatter. This Mr. Billing was a handsome fellow of 30 or thereabouts. He had rosy cheeks, a prosperous dark moustache, and eyes that, when they weren't shining with devotion to Miss Mansfield, were shining with all of an attorney's shrewdness and wit. He walked with a quick, springy steps and put off his cloak with an air. These facts Smith had learned from observing him from the dark top of the stairs, for, as Miss Mansfield had never yet seen fit to introduce the stable boy to her suitor, Mr. Billing and Smith had not yet met, even though he called often and unexpectedly, knowing that, in courtship, the sudden is worth its weight in gold. Sometimes he'd come mid-morning with a, I was passing and couldn't resist, and sometimes mid-afternoon with her, I found myself at your door as if by magic. And then there'd be much cheerful laughter, and in he'd come and settle for an hour, dispensing pleasure to Miss Mansfield and irritation to Smith, who would be banished to the kitchen. For Miss Mansfield preferred to break off the lesson rather than have her suitor and the stable boy, whose tongue she couldn't answer for, meet face to face. This uneasiness of hers persisted and even grew, and what at first had been a fleeting and foolish embarrassment became a deep and odd fear, so that our meeting she'd begun preventing almost lightly became an affair of strange importance that must be avoided at all costs. She'd grown deeply fond of Smith, who darted into her heart as neatly as she supposed he'd once darted from doorway to doorway in the freezing friendless streets. An extraordinary child, a fascinating, quick-witted, dear-faced, obliging and determined child, but a child whose sometimes violent tongue she couldn't answer for, and whose resentment at Mr. Billings' interruptions alarmed her. More and more she came to dread the meeting she'd so far put off, but which she knew she could not put off forever. There's no doubt that, by keeping all this to herself, she'd helped it grow to formidable dimension in her mind. But Smith's resentment seemed to be growing likewise, as if his patience was running out, and as if there was some goal he'd set in his heart on, and the nearer he came to it, the more enraged he was at it being delayed. Which was nothing less than the truth, for Smith was now very close to being able to read. His long battle was nearly won. Letters were making words for him, words were making sentences. Great pages of print that scarce 4 weeks ago had seemed no more than a mad patterning of the paper, now spoke haltingly to him, even told stories, as if long-dead gentlemen woke up under his struggling eyes, buttonholed his mind, and breathed their thoughts and dreams into it. Gentlemen who were dead and dust 1,000 years stirred and shifted and began to live their lives again. But still, there were gaps and lapses and conjunctions of letters they seemed to have no business together. He thought often of the document, but he knew it was useless to him till he could fill those gaps and lapses. So he waited for the day when Miss Mansfield should declare, "Smith, now you can read whatever your heart desires." But with the over-attentive attorney's interruptions, that day did not come till a certain Tuesday morning, when the event Miss Mansfield had tried so hard to prevent also came to pass, as sooner or later it had to. "Well, Smith," she said with a proud and affectionate smile, "now all the wisdom of the world is yours for the taking, for you can read, my dear." On which Smith's heart leapt almost to the skies, and when there came at almost the same moment the familiar double knock on the front door, he felt, in place of his customary resentment, a grand relief that he could escape and caper and dance in private triumph. "It's Mr. Billing, miss," he said with a cheerfulness that amazed Miss Mansfield, come cooing. "So I'll be off and hide myself now. The best of luck to you, miss. I'm sure you'll be very happy." With that, he fled from the library in high delight, and with the best will in the world, for Smith, when he wished anyone happiness, really meant it, happiness being a word he didn't use lightly, stopped in the hall to wish Mr. Billing the same. "Best of happiness in your cooing, Mr. Billing," he cried, then faltered on his way down the stairs. The rosy-cheeked attorney had gone a deathly white. A look of wild amazement had come upon his face. His eyes had widened, his mouth dropped open, a shudder had gone through him. Then, as abruptly as his colour had gone, so did he, without so much as a word for the lady of his heart. The door slammed violently, and Smith, sensing he was the cause, went hastily to the kitchen, puzzled and vaguely alarmed. About half an hour after he left, Mr. Billing returned, and in the state of such high excitement, said the footman who'd admitted him, that he felt sure the gentleman had at last plucked up his courage to ask for the mistress's hand. He'd been shown into the library where the mistress and the master were wondering on his unaccountable departure. The footman had listened long enough to hear Mr. Billing declare that Miss Mansfield was looking handsomer than ever he could ever remember. "So she is," nodded Meg wisely, "for love paints our faces something beautiful." Here the housekeeper, a single lady with a complexion midway between a lemon and a turnip, muttered "stuff and nonsense," but looked very wistful, and Smith, whose uneasiness had taken a sharp turn for the worse on the attorney's return, said, "Thank goodness." The housekeeper looked at him curiously, and Smith, feeling the vague danger past, said, "It was only that I thought he'd been took ill before," and went on to relate the brief meeting which he'd previously kept to himself. The coachman, who'd come into the kitchen for his morning mug of ale, shook his head with all the pessimism of a man whose days were spent reasoning with horses. "Mark my words, he's most likely got a wife and a child in Clapham or somewheres, and the sight of our young Smith reminded him. Small wonder he went white, any man would." "Stuff and nonsense," declared the housekeeper, looking even more wistful. "Nothing but biliousness. There's a deal of it about, just popped out to clear his head. Very sensible." But Meg was of the opinion that Mr. Billing's sudden pallor and departure were due to nothing other than a brief loss of courage in his heart's intentions, which he'd forthwith gone out to strengthen at the nearest tavern. "I'll wager he'd smell of brandy about him," she said. These three opinions would now provoke the Vine Street household into a lively dispute for some minutes, during which the coachman was rejected with contempt, and the housekeepers thought the most likely, though it was Meg's that won the day, for the Vine Street household was of a sentimental and hopeful turn of mind, and always looked forward to the time when Miss Mansfield's tempestuous person would be removed happily to another establishment. The footman who'd answered the door now agreed that there had been a brandyish air about the attorney, and the parlour-maid who'd been listening at the library door came down with the news that the attorney seemed tongue-tied. A sure sign for someone in his calling of being in last extreme of love. On this, there was a general burst of smiling and pleasure, and the unfortunate coachman had his elbow jogged as he sought to hide his pessimistic face in his mug of ale. Then Meg, in a mood of powerful tenderness, laid her large arm about Smith's shoulders and declared, "And this little mite's the one who's brought it all on. The mistress had grown that tender since he's been with us. He's warmed her heart and opened it up to Mr. Billing's cooing. It would never have come without our little Smith. So give honour and kindness where the same are due." With that, she imprinted a large moist kiss on Smith's surprised face. He blushed, and everyone smiled, including the coachman, who laughed loudest of all. So in a matter of moments, Smith was become quite a hero, and when the parlour-maid, who'd gone back to her post at the library door, came down with the news that Smith was wanted, everyone, even Smith himself, was convinced it was because Miss Mansfield wanted to show him off the wonders she'd worked on him. He got off his chair and straightened his coat. The housekeeper found a comb and brought order to his hair. A footman wiped a smut off his face. Another suggested a quick bath and chuckled, "Go on, Smith. Do us all proud, Smith." "God bless you, Smith. Don't forget, Smith. We're all behind you, lad." And so they were, for as Smith went proudly up the stairs, the Vine Street household followed closely after him to give him a last pat on the back as he knocked on the library door and went inside. It was just on midday. A brisk fire was burning in the library, but the weather was turned very bitter, and the sky bulged with unshed snow. For a second time, Smith and Mr. Billing stared at one another, and for a second time the attorney shuddered to the depths of his soul. It seemed, "It is him. This is the boy I saw in the court. This boy stabbed Field. I saw him. He is the murderer. My poor friends, how monstrously you've been deceived." Mr. Billing was the man from Godliman Street, the same man who'd questioned the unlucky bookseller.